Everything that I'm going to say from now on is night and day difference. Everyone has a different story.
We are disaster. I mean, we are integral to the shape and form that disaster assumes.
One of the crew comes into the wheelhouse and says the boat's on fire.
The first thing you notice is the hearse parked out front.
Why would she want to shoot either of them?
Hello, and welcome to a very special Halloween episode of the Long Island History Project. This is the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz, and I am your host. Today we're going to start with a little thought experiment. You're dead. We're going to say that you died of natural causes in the late 19th century in a modest two-story house on a side street of a small industrial city not far from Philadelphia. And less than 24 hours after you pass, two men appear at your door in long coats carrying heavy bags and requesting to see you. They're ushered up to your bedside, and while the older man checks his watch and gives directions, his younger colleague unpacks a set of medical instruments and lays them out beside your body. We'll skip the details, but suffice to say, your brain is removed and taken back to a laboratory in an unnamed medical institution in the city of brotherly love. There it is weighed, recorded, and placed in a jar on a shelf next to other jars, each with a brain and a clean white label. Last name, first initial. Now, questions. Do you think you can still think when your brain's in a jar? Can you still perceive events as they occur or the passage of time? Do you keep your memories? This might sound like the setup to an H.P. Lovecraft story or the start of an M. Night Shyamalan movie, but it's history and medical science, and maybe a little poetic license. Of course, there's also a slight chance that you are, right now, actually a brain in a jar. And maybe all this, what you're listening to, is a memory of a podcast you once heard, and you're playing it over and over as your gray matter quietly floats behind glass. It's hard to say. But if that's the case, cheer up, because if you're hearing my voice, that means that I'm in there with you. We all are, right now, just inside your brain. Me, you, and today's very special guest.
My name is Jim Wright. I'm a retired professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at University of Calgary, and I have a long-standing interest in the history of medicine, going back to when I was a medical student at Ohio State University, where I was simultaneously enrolled in medical school, doing a PhD in experimental pathology and a Master of Arts in History of Medicine.
That's great. And first off, thank you for joining us. This will become Long Island related as we reveal the topic. But I came across your work, and that led me down a rabbit hole of following up on a lot of strands in medical history that I'm hoping you can illuminate. And we should probably say up front, we are going to break the first rule of Brain Club by talking about Brain Club.
Okay. Sounds interesting.
Let's maybe start with broad strokes. Brains are a part of this topic. And from the early 19th century, the state of medical understanding of the brain and anatomy and scientific investigations into bodies. Do you want to sort of give us some groundwork on that?
Sure. As you noted, very little was known about the brain in the 19th century. One of the earliest attempts was phrenology, which was kind of a pseudoscience. It was based in late 18th and early 19th century belief that palpable bumps on the surface of the skull reflect the degree of development and therefore also function of 27 different underlying organs of the brain, and that these 27 organs control different personality traits. And so it was believed that people could, by palpating a living person's skull, predict the owner's personality traits and both strengths and weaknesses. By the middle of the 19th century, most people realized that this was rather foolish, but it was still popular throughout the 19th century. But it was replaced largely by legitimate science in the late 19th century that inquired whether or not brains of geniuses were anatomically different from brains of ordinary normal citizens or even criminals or murderers. And so this led to mutual autopsy societies and brain clubs.
And so, and you have a great piece where you detail the, would you say it originated in France or rose to prominence in France, these societies?
Yes, so the very first society started in Paris in 1876. The idea came about at a meeting of the Society of Anthropology in Paris, and a number of anthropologists and other members of this society decided that it would be interesting to study the brains of each other. And so they came up with the idea of a brain donation club that would look at the brains of individuals. So individual members would provide a description of their personality and also consent for their brain to be removed by autopsy after their death.
Just as a side note, it's interesting that it took a while to find these records, right? This was not necessarily a prominent part of medical history. They I don't know if they consciously these records fell into the basement or were kind of shunted aside as a dead end in medical history, but it wasn't well documented, would you say, until some people started uncovering it?
Yes, that would be correct. I would say most of this was entirely unknown. So the Mutual Autopsy Society of Paris was first discovered by a PhD student, Jennifer Heck. She discovered these records in the Museum of Man in Paris, which actually Paul Broca, who was an anthropologist who started the Anthropology Society in Paris, his brain was sitting there in a jar. So Heck ran into these records. So she did the kind of original research on the Mutual Autopsy Society in Paris. In North America, in Philadelphia, the American Anthropometric Society formed, and really nothing much had been written about that prior to my first paper on Henry Ware Cattell and Walt Whitman. So that would be kind of the background.
Were these secret societies, or how well publicized would these people say, "Hey, I'm in the mutual"? Did they own up to it? Were they proud to be in it, or was more of a something that happened behind closed doors?
That differed between Paris and Philadelphia. In Paris, many of the members were quite proud to be members, and there was a anti-religious element to it. The members were mostly atheists, or in Paris they were called freethinkers. And this was a time in France where there was a battle between kind of freethinkers and the Roman Catholic Church. And so the Mutual Autopsy Society in Paris was well publicized, and it was kind of flaunting the desecration of the body at the Catholic Church. And once again, that was scholarship from Jennifer Heck, who's written a book about how that came about. In Philadelphia, it was a little bit more of a secret society. The original members were faculty members in the medical school at either University of Pennsylvania or at Jefferson Medical College. there would have been maybe a dozen or so or less that were openly members, but they recruited about 300 other members who were mostly secret members. And these would be, some of them were politicians, some of them were other intellectuals, some of them were even ministers. So it was a slightly different group.
And was sort of the thinking of the day that the smarter the man, the bigger the brain?
Yes, exactly. And it was also assumed that this would be readily shown, but the first few autopsies that were performed in Paris actually had surprising results. And for some reason or another, some of the very smartest people did not have very large brains. And so they assumed that they must be errors in recording the information. So they repeated some of these studies and found that, yes, it was true that brain size and weight did not correlate with the intelligence of the individual.
And so the idea, if we stick with the society in Philadelphia, that they would keep this collection of brains, and it would sort of be an ongoing research project that they would continue to collect samples and weigh them and document them.
Yes, exactly. The idea was that the brains would be collected and then studied, many at a time rather than kind of individually. In Paris, the brains were kind of studied sequentially as the individuals died. And oftentimes, autopsy reports would even appear in the local newspapers.
And in terms of medical history, the ability to take a brain out of a body and preserve it was not state of the art, or it had to be, they had to kind of figure out how to do that.
Yes, that's correct. At the time of the Mutual Autopsy Society of Paris, there would have been very poor ability to fix and preserve the brain. So that is a science that improved throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Formalin, as a modern day fixative, was just discovered in the 1890s. So many of these studies were done before 1890. And so the fixatives were very primitive and required multiple changes of fixative, oftentimes initially every day, and then eventually every week, and then eventually every 2 weeks.
And so you mentioned, your research into Henry Ware. Is it Cattell or Cattell?
Cattell.
Cattell. Do you want to give us a little bit? So he's one of the players in our story here. He was, well, why don't you describe a little bit about what he was doing in the late 19th century?
Okay. Henry Ware Cattell was born in 1862. He was the son of a kind of prominent Presbyterian theologian who was president of Lafayette College. He went to medical school at University of Pennsylvania, got a job after graduation as a demonstrator of morbid anatomy. And he was also a pathologist at Blockley Hospital, which was later named Philadelphia General Hospital, but was a typical almshouse type of hospital. These were large city hospitals that specialized in taking care of indigent patients. He, in 1892, became the pathologist for the Wistar Institute of Anatomy and Biology and prosector for the American Anthropometric Society, while he was also serving as demonstrator of morbid anatomy at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so the term prosector, which I had to do some digging into myself, the American Anthropometric Society, why did they need a prosector and what did the prosector do?
So the prosector was a pathologist who assisted with the autopsy. The more prominent members of the American Anthropometric Society were busy practicing physicians. And so, as I mentioned, the preparation of the brain after it's been removed is quite tedious. So they needed somebody to essentially perform parts of the autopsy other than the removal of the brain, but the examination of the rest of the body to determine why the individual died, and then to protect and maintain the brain.
Okay. And so Cattell would help assist removing or retrieving the donations of the members, I guess you could say. And the one thing I did have to stop reading in your research and the rabbit hole I went down, he was well known for his skill with autopsies or wrote a guidebook to how to do them. And you describe some of the techniques, and that's where I had to stop reading.
Yes. So he was considered to be an expert on autopsy technique, and he published two different books and three editions of the latter of the two books.
And so we are working our way towards March 1892. So we'll bring in our Long Island connection. For those that know the history of Walt Whitman, he died in Camden, New Jersey. He had moved there. He only spent his early life in Brooklyn and on Long Island. I'll ballpark this. So, Whitman was towards the end of his life. I know he had certain medical conditions. He had a stroke, was partly paralyzed, not in the greatest of shape. And that's where he did eventually die. So as you document, there was an autopsy performed on Whitman. Do you know what brought the society to his door or why Cattell and the others were there to look at Whitman?
Well, they would have been interested because he was an intellectual. The family did not want an autopsy, but his personal physician, a Dr. Longacre, basically indicated that Whitman had agreed to an autopsy, had consented to it, and had another member of the society who had heard that statement. And so that was deemed to be legitimate consent, a verbal consent witnessed by another individual.
And what's interesting, I think you quote this in your piece, but apparently in one of Cattell's writings, he's talking about consent. And he said you should definitely ask for consent, but not necessarily from the nearest relative.
Yes, so Cattell played a little bit loose with autopsy consent. And in fact, between his first textbook and his second textbook, he appears to have developed kind of maybe lesser ethics related to how rigorous one should be in explaining exactly what would be done and obtaining kind of a full informed consent.
And so the following facts unfold in various ways through various people's research. But if we try to go chronologically, eventually Cattell is no longer the prosector, and his successor is doing brain research at the Society's collection. And I guess he was hoping to prove the size and the weight of these geniuses in this collection. And he mentions Walt Whitman's brain in passing.
Yes. So there was a individual who was a member of we'll just call it the AAS.
Thank you.
And so he published a very long paper in 1907. So this is 15 years after the Whitman autopsy. And it was entitled A Study of the Brains of Six Eminent Scientists and Scholars Belonging to the American Anthropometric Society. And he publishes this 130-page long paper describing in great detail the brains of these six individuals. But in passing, he had two sentences, one of which was, The brain of Walt Whitman, together with the jar in which it had been placed, was said to have been dropped on the floor by a careless assistant. Unfortunately, not even the pieces were saved. And so you can well imagine that the press was more interested in that little titillating tidbit than they were in the other 130 pages of his paper. This quickly became kind of a news item in newspapers across the United States.
No, so even with that initial mention of Whitman's brain, it kind of died down. There was no investigation, or was there any kind of attempt to bring anyone to account back in the early 1900s?
It seems clear that professor of anatomy Edward Spitzka, who wrote this paper in 1907, was made aware that there had been an accident with the brain. At the same time, or a few years later, when a newspaper in New York was doing a story about the American Anthropometric Society, Cattell mentioned to the reporter that it told him a different story, basically kind of hiding the negligence of the destruction of the brain. He told the newspaper that the family had permitted the autopsy but did not allow him to keep the brain. And so he had simply weighed it and put it back in the body, which made no sense because the autopsy was done at Whitman's home, and there wouldn't have been an accurate way to weigh the brain. So, that story was clearly not, feasible. But it was apparently Cattell's way of trying to deal with consequences that would eventually happen when it was discovered, more widely.
Right. So he left the society. What's his later career?
So he continued working as a pathologist throughout the 1890s. He moved into kind of medical editing, and he was editor of several different journals. He was for a while editor of Lippincott's Medical Dictionary, but he did continue to do some pathology. During World War I, he was enlisted as a major, and he worked at the Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C., and then eventually was posted with the American Expeditionary Forces as a pathologist in France.
So we're kind of going chronologically through the research revelations, and one of the companion pieces I read next to yours was from Brian Burrell, The Strange Case of Whitman's Brain. And I don't know how much you want to speak to that, but his research is published before your piece, and he comes down pretty clearly on who was responsible for the destruction of the brain. And do you have anything to say about just where his research left it?
Yes, and his research was published, I think, maybe like 2003. He came up with essentially the idea that the dropping of the container holding the brain was where the people who made the 1931 Frankenstein film came up with the idea of kind of a hunchback assistant that dropped the container labeled normal brain and provided Dr. Frankenstein the brain that was labeled abnormal that had been removed from a murderer. And so I thought that was one of the kind of the interesting aspects of Burrell's work, that not only did he discover the information about the brain being dropped, yet he also linked it to Frankenstein. And he noted that when Mary Shelley wrote the book Frankenstein back in 1818, it wasn't possible to remove brains and store them in liquid, but that this would have been well-known technique by the time the movie was made. And so I thought that was totally fascinating.
So I don't know if this was in a footnote or in the sentence that jumps out at me, and you tell me if this was a pivotal moment, but and I forget the year, but Cattell's diary was discovered and sold on eBay. So
Yes.
is that a piece of what helped for you unlock some of the missing pieces?
So I was kind of well into the story before I came on to that, but that's probably the key to everything as far as what really happened. So Cattell had maintained a diary apparently, and after the paper by Burrell, individuals who were interested in Walt Whitman were aware of the existence of Cattell, and one of them found Cattell's diary being sold on eBay and was apparently the successful bidder. And so in the diary, it actually states exactly what did happen. The brain was not destroyed by dropping a glass container, it was destroyed by negligence. Cattell essentially left the lid off the top of the jar with the brain in the fixative. The fixative at that period of time would have needed to be replaced very frequently in order to preserve the brain well. And so, by virtue of the fact that this was not done and there was no lid on top, the fixative evaporated, and so the brain simply decomposed. And he didn't discover it for about 6 months, I think.
Oof. So I guess two questions. One, were you able to actually read the diary either physically or through scans or something? Or
No, and in fact, it's not even a matter of public record who owns the diary. Basically, there was a paper in the Walt Whitman Quarterly, I think, that basically described that part of the story.
but it does sound like at least Cattell realized the magnitude, or he took it pretty hard.
Yes, it really obviously changed his life because he transitioned from primarily doing pathology more so to being a writer about medical topics.
And was there an intimation of he had an assistant who was blackmailing him with that secret?
Yes, so the story that was uncovered, the paper based on eBay was published by somebody with the last name of Goslin in 2014. So there was mention in the diary that Cattell had fired an assistant and that this assistant was then blackmailing him, to kind of keep the story covered up. And Cattell apparently, according to what I read from Goslin, who obtained access to the diary, was that Cattell was actually suicidal about this. He was worried about his entire future career.
So if we step back, how do you view this chapter in medical history? Like, can you sympathize with the men that thought their brains were big and wanted to take them out of each other's heads and study them? Or is it a sort of a chapter that's not laughable, but a wrong-headed mistake?
So, I think it's just kind of progression of science. It started with phrenology, and then a bunch of intellectual people think maybe their brains are bigger than others. They set up a society to examine this. They determined that this is not the case. In some ways, this kind of figures into studies that were performed after this as kind of a follow-up. There had been theories in the 19th century that the weight or the size of brains was inferior in races other than white, and that male brains were superior to female brains. A neuroanatomist named Bert Wilder at Cornell University he did research on brain size as it relates to race, as did another individual, Franklin Mull, in Philadelphia. And both of them kind of independently determined that studies that had been in the late 19th century that had purported that brains in blacks or non-whites were smaller and inferior to those of white males. These had been based on studies where the individual examining the brain knew the race of the brain they were studying. They were very small studies, and that they were directed at trying to prove something. And that if you examine larger numbers of brains, that there were no racial differences at all. As far as the difference in size between men's brains and women's brains statistically are smaller, but women are smaller. And so basically, the research that was done showed that essentially brain size is determined by body height. So tall women have larger brains than small men.
So in terms of the research you've done and the research into this aspect of the history, did the men that were involved in these societies, the ones that survived to realize that it wasn't a valid assumption, did they sort of push this part of their history aside? Like, is it hard to find archival records of any of these scientists and pathologists sort of owning up to, oh yeah, back in the 1890s, I had this crazy idea, or does it kind of get pushed back into the darkness for them?
I'm not sure whether it would be, you would say it would be pushed back, but it certainly doesn't rise to the surface. I mean, the way science functions is people always promote their good stuff and kind of forget about the bad stuff they did.
Sure.
So I don't think it's just these individuals, but the natural flow of science is if you have 3 different research projects going and one fails, one takes off and is prospering, you're going to pursue the one that takes off and is prospering. It is of interest that William Osler, one of the probably most prominent physicians of modern time, he was a member of the Anthropometric Society, and when he died at Oxford in 1919, an autopsy was performed in his home, and the brain was fixed for 4.5 months and then shipped to the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia. His brain traveled all over the place. So it started in a bottle in Oxford, went to the Wistar Institute. It was studied there. A very prominent neurologist, Wilder Penfield, from the Montreal Neurological Institute, went to Philadelphia to give a lecture, but only agreed to give the lecture if he could return to Montreal with William Osler's brain to study it there. And so that did happen. The brain was then returned back to the Wistar Institute. At some point, some microscopic slides were made of it, and the medical historian Michael Bliss, who wrote kind of the definitive biography of Sir William Osler, was able to buy a microscopic slide of a section of William Osler's brain on eBay.
Huh. Well, and you can imagine with Whitman's personality, and if his brain had been preserved, I can see it going on whistle-stop tours and poetry readings for decades after, so maybe it's a good thing he was able to rest in peace. We don't always go in for spooky season, but we hope you enjoyed that left turn into some of the darker corners of medical history, one that is tangential but also puts a final point on a Long Island history story, the final fate of Walt Whitman's brain. I want to thank Dr. Wright for his time and for his research. He continues to find new aspects of medical history to dive into, and we may hear from him again someday. For now, you can check our show notes at longislandhistoryproject.org, where we will list a brain bibliography. You can find Dr. Wright's writings and the other articles we mentioned in this podcast. You'll also find notes on our music selections for this episode. We switched it up for Halloween. We'll be back to our regular intros and outros next time around. But for now, thank you for listening.